Shalom. This is the fourth week in the book of Genesis, and we're in the parsha Vayeira, which means to, and he saw. Now, to begin, I want to go back a step into Lech Lecha, because we need to pick up Ishmael for a couple of reasons. But first off, in Genesis 17, the story of Abraham's circumcision and that of Ishmael's occurred when Ishmael was 13 and Abraham was about 99. Now, this became the eighth law, if you would. Remember, in the days of Noah, 7 laws had been created. And now here we have the eighth law, the law of circumcision, which was designed specifically for the Jewish people. Now, God said after this that there was a covenant between he and Abraham's descendants. And Abraham asked the question, can this apply to Ishmael? Obviously, I'm 99 years old. How in a world could I possibly have children? But God told him, well, Ishmael will have a great nation, or a great number of people that will be coming from him, but he is not part of this covenant. Now, Ishmael came into the world by a natural means. By that I mean, he was born in time. Abraham was capable, and so was Hagar. But in the case of Isaac, Isaac's arrival was totally supernatural. His mom is 90 years old, long past the time of menstruation. Abraham himself may still be acceptable or viable, but there is the supernatural element that's there. When we think of Ishmael, we're going to have to think of the rational world. But in the case of Isaac, it's a supernatural world, because it relates to God in specifics. Now, Ishmael was 13 years old at the time of this whole thing, but at the same point in time, Isaac was 8 days old, and the covenant began by saying it happens when one is 8 days old that they should be circumcised. So there's a significance there that will happen later. So when Isaac is born, Abraham and Sarah were said to have been married for some 75 years. Now, in our story today, I want to go back, and I want to take specifically a couple verses. And those verses are in chapter 21 of Genesis. And the reason I'm only taking a couple is because of Rabbi Mendel Kaplan, who inspired me to dig and research and to go back into the annals, because of an event that happened, which I just simply wrote off as simply being okay. And it begins in verse number 7. So if you want to look there, it says, and she said, who is the one who said to Abraham, Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned. Abraham made a great feast on that day, the day that Isaac was weaned. Now, there's a lot of things that are being said about this. First off, the idea of having a celebration because a child no longer needs its mother's milk seemed rather unusual. So many thought that what he was talking about was the bar mitzvah of the child. This would be the first recorded bar mitzvah. There wasn't one happening up until then. Now, others would simply say that literally this was a story about the milk itself. Another thought is that this meal came after Isaac was taught through the books that he recorded the understanding of who God was. Now, whatever the reason, Sarah is so happy for this party, because it also gives her an opportunity to prove that this child was hers. Because in today, or even back then, the fact that she was able at 90 years of age to produce a child, and then for the next year and a half, 2 years, she's able to feed it breast milk. And not only was she able to feed it breast milk, but she also was able to take care of other women's children. So this was a proof that this miracle actually occurred, and that Sarah did not just simply pick up a child that she had found abandoned and turned it into her son, which she would now call Isaac. So anyway, we're going to have a great party. Now, how big was the party? Well, according to Bereshit Rabbah, the party was thrown with God present, obviously, but there were many, many, many dignitaries. Among them would have been Shem, Avner, and for at that point in time, others would attend. Avimelech would be one. Now, the dignitaries would also include about 32 kings and their entourages. And to say no least, Og. Og would have attended this party, because there's going to be a midrashic understanding about Og that's going to lead us to understanding today, because we're going to deal with, in limited way, the Iranian crisis that's coming because of the nuclear warheads. So all of these people have been gathering. Now, in this process of gathering, Isaac is there, Ishmael is there. And so the Rishon begin, the Rishon, those are the sages of this particular period of time, the 11th century or thereabouts. It's the Rashis and the Radaks and Ashlik and all of those other characters would have been there thinking, why did God have him bring his friends together? To thank God? Well, Rashbam said, well, we're going to have a party because he was weaning somebody. Now, Radak suggests that once he was weaned and he was speaking, so now it was that they planned for him to be taught. So with his weaning, understand that he's only 2+ years, because weaning is to be over before he turns 3. So somewhere around the 23rd month, Isaac has finished weaning. But what's amazing about that is also that Isaac himself is going to be able to speak, not just what we would call baby talk, but he was literally capable of speech, comprehension, and understanding. So this was a point at the point of weaning in which his father was planning to teach him what we would call the Torah at that time. This is the beginning of what we call Isaac's spiritual career. Now, there was a suggestion centuries ago that there was a celebration of sorts for this kind of thing, and that there were 5 or 6 rituals that were performed that had been based loosely upon what had happened in this particular case, but those processes have not really been maintained. So all we have is the records of what happened back then and not what happened in the days of Isaac. So the child is speaking clearly, and he has an acute level of understanding that's far above everybody else. So the question then becomes, why isn't this a party for his birthday instead? Why now at his and not at his Brit? Was it because of the uncertainty of the times? Was it because children in those days did not survive long? Too many things, including disease and famines and all the other things, disturbed that process. Well, anyway, he's a mensha. He's a little person as we're going through our story. Now, Abraham was told that Isaac's birth was prophetic and that it was special, that the circumcision was special. And way back in 17, he was told that Sarai would no longer be her name. Her name would be Sarah. She would become a queen. Now, Sarah was the real feature of the guests. Here she is, about 92 years of age, weaning. We're ending the weaning of her son, but still able to produce milk and wean other children at that particular point in time. Now, there's a midrashic writing from Bereshit Rabbah, which said that something strange happened at this feast. Oh, didn't you say that Avram was like a sterile mule? In other words, they were kidding Og because of comments that he had made in the past, because he was now 100 years old, actually 102, and he now had a child. And so the question then becomes, how didn't you say that he was sterile? Didn't you say he was like an old ox or a mule? Well, Og said, and this is the important part, that puny little Jew, with one finger I could crush him. And this you will build a nation, and upon this you will build a nation. And then there was a heavenly voice that came down and says, you are mocking his child, and you will live to see hundreds of thousands and millions of them. And at the end, you will fall into their hands, the hands of these children. Now, after Og had made his comment, which was obviously barbed, his comment really struck a chord, because it goes back to something else that's going to happen yet future. The future event is going to be based loosely upon this same idea, that in one day he could wipe them out. There was another character in the Bible who also, through bribery and trickery, had convinced Ahasuerus that he should wipe out this Jewish scum all in one day. And so therefore, with bribes and other things, he began the process of attempting to bring an end to all the Jews in the world, wherever they happen to be. Now, we know the man's name was Haman. But what's fascinating about this is we got to go back and bring in 2 points. Point number one, the day in which Isaac was born. Isaac would have been born on Pesach, the 14th of Nisan. The events of this weaning had to occur before the 24th month, or the second year, and it was usually on the 11th month that it actually happened. Now, if we think about it, and Isaac is 23 months old at this point in time, then we will find out that his day that this feast occurs will be on the 14th of Adar. The 14th of Adar was the day that Haman had proclaimed as the day that Israel would be wiped off the planet. So therefore, the 14th has become Purim, a day of celebration. And we also know that in history, Og and Sion both will be destroyed by these little people. And we're not told exactly the day, but I would have to think, well, never mind. That's what I have to think. So anyway, this whole idea that I'm talking about, or I'm sharing with you, comes through the idea of the Parsha Kisi, not in the Bible, but in the Zohar. It takes us and gives us a basis by which we're going to find out what's happening. And the place that it's going to happen, or the place that we find, is Persia. Persia becomes very, very significant, because Persia, as we all understand today, Persia is Iran. And so our story is going to parallel that, because right now in Iran, the mullahs are suggesting what? In one day, we will wipe Israel off the map. Haman, Og, all of them had the same idea. Now, earlier in this midrash, or in the midrash on the book of Esther, it says that the great one of creation was there, and it quotes from what's called the code of God, code for God, the idea that God is ever present and he is never invisible, or he's always invisible. But there's a hint to finding this in Esther, because remember, in Esther, never is the name of God written. Now, there's 191 times when the word king is used, Melech. And 26 of those times, it specifically says King Ahasuerus. But the rest of the times it doesn't suggest that. And so many have understood God never put his name into the book of Esther, but his name is throughout the book of Esther as king. Now it goes on to say in the Parsha, or they talk about the fact that Israel was doing tshuva and the fact that they will return with you. In the book of Deuteronomy, this goes on to say, Israel is going to go through, we obviously know, a period of dispersion. And this point in time is called the Adom Gulah. The Adom Gulah is the dispersion or the exile of Rome. Happened way back in the days of Titus when he invaded this Israel and Jerusalem and sacked the city and began to send all of the people into exile. Well, the Baal Shem Tov's grandson, who was also a rabbi, taught several things, and scholars asked him a question, which is a link or a remez, a hint of something else. He said, is there really something in Genesis that ties us to the book of Esther? And he said, yes, Vayeira Hagomel, the day he was weaned. The letters that here that are, well, there's a book that I'm getting that hasn't arrived yet, but we've already started through it with my wife and I. And that's the book called 70 by Rabbi Trugman. In the book 70 is a discussion of the multiple ways in which a text can be visited. In other words, every letter, every word, every sentence has multiple meanings. And it all depends upon the strategy you use to uncover those meanings. Well, the Baal Shem Tov had told his grandson about this whole event. And so he brings it up again at this particular point in time. Now, the word Vayeira Hagomel means day he is weaned. But also, if you begin to go back and look at that, you find out that there is a word that can be formed from those four words, and the word is Megillah. Now, Megillah has the same gematria or mathematical equivalent as the name Mazalah, which is the word that can be formed from Vayeira Hagomel. So this is found in the book of Zohar in the Parsha called Titzi. So when Moses at the time received the Torah, he received it on behalf of the entire Jewish people, and he received also the Megillah called Esther. Now, because of the merit of this Abraham celebration, we now have a link back to the Megillah. Now, if Moshe had gotten the Megillah, what happened to it? Well, we have to understand how it is understood. Nachmanides, the Ramban, wrote a preface in the Humash with his interpretation. He said, Humash is all God's name, can re-break the words and find multiple messages. And by moving the letters to fit the previous words or to subtract, you get a multiple ideas and thoughts. Rambam alludes here to the Bible codes. If you were looking at the Bible right now and you were to look at the Hebrew side, Rambam said that if we took the letters, the words that are here, and we slid letters to the right or to the left, we'd form new words. And those new words would give us new understandings or new ideas. And that's what exactly he was saying was happening here. So when Moses is writing down the story of the first 5 books, he's also, in a sense, writing down the Megillah. He's establishing for us an understanding. Now, the book of Hazanu, the Parsha Hazanu, back in Deuteronomy, And if you want to turn back there for a second, I want to show you Deuteronomy and Hazenu. Hazenu is only 52 verses long. It's it's on the chapter 32. That's where we're going to go. Give ear, O heavens. Now, we're not going to read all of that, but as you go through there was a lot of understanding in those 32 verses or 52 verses. Now, one of the things that I had learned or I had shared with you before is the fact that the verses themselves are also represent numbers. So in other words, the number of the sentence that we look at gives us understandings, each and of itself. So in this particular year, which is 5,782, if we go to the 82nd verse, we're on Deuteronomy 32, verse number 31. And Moses is suggesting this, or Noahides is suggesting the fact that we can look at this way. Now, there was a story in here that Noahides' greatest student, or one of his great students, Avenu, had his guard, because he was so rich, he had a palace, and so he sent his guard over to pick up Rambam, and he brought him back to his palace and made him stand there in chains while he took a pig and slaughtered it. And then he began to eat it. And obviously Ramban at this point in time is crying. He doesn't understand what's going on. Why are we doing this? And Avenu looks at him and says, "You're a liar. I cannot believe you. And I cannot believe the Bible because of what you've taught me." And he says, "Why not?" And he says, "Because you told me that every name is in the Bible. I find my name nowhere in the Bible. In fact, I find no actions anywhere in the Bible." Well, given a moment, Rambam looks at him and says, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 26. And he says to him, and I'll read it in the Hebrew, Amariti ahesnu ashperit meknosh zik rom. Now, if you take the third letter of each of those words, it spells out the name Rabbi Avner. Now, at this particular point in time, Avner, Avenu is just dumbstruck, and he begins to weep, and he has no recourse. He's now slaughtered the pig. He's now eaten the pig in his presence, and he asks the question, "Well, what can I do? How can I gain amends from this?" Well, if you looked at verse 26, it talked about going into isolation to be never seen again. In the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, the 14th chapter, the 14th verse, we have this story. And the story begins, or holds, excuse me, I dropped my papers. The story holds, God devises means so that no one should forever be banished from him. Samuel 14:14, 1 Samuel. So in the story then, having read the third letter, he begins to understand exactly what he needs to do. He needs to vanish and never to be heard from again, at which he can achieve his tikkun and come back whole. Now, this whole idea of middle letters and all of those other things is really a Torah code. In fact, the first time this was uncovered was by a rabbi named Michal Dov Wismandel. And he was going through the book of Esther. And the question was asked of him, can you honestly find Esther's name in the book of Esther? Well, actually, not in the book of Esther. I want you to find Esther's name in the Bible. And so he began to sit and think about it. And he says, well, Esther has 12,196 letters total in the whole book. So he goes to the first Aleph, because that's the first letter of Esther's name in Hebrew. And so he finds the first Aleph and he counts 12,196 letters. And the next letter is the Samach. He counts another 12,196 letters, Tav. He counts another 12,196 letters, Resh. Skip counting, he found the name of Esther. Maybe that is what he meant by finding the Megillah Esther in the book of the Torah. Well, anyway, the story of this celebration was included in this book, matches the celebration that's found in the book of Esther. It's the festival of Purim. Now remember, Og had a hint at wiping out the lot of Jews with his thumb to rub them out. Well, it was a story of genocide that was wiping out Isaac and therefore the Jewish people, just like Haman is now thinking about doing here. Haman's words of wiping out Israel were never used again until now. The mullahs tell us that Israel will be wiped out in one day. The mullahs live where Haman lived. Now, the thing that we need to understand is Persia, unlike Israel, even though it's considered an Arab nation, is not Arabic. It's Indo-European. It's from the same lot as the lot of Japheth. If you went back to Genesis chapter 10 and you looked at the characters that were mentioned there, the birthing of the different tribes and those kinds of things, if you look under this title that you have here, you're going to find a character called Tiras. Tiras. It's in Genesis 1 or 10:2. Tiras is the progenitor of the Persian people. Now that I've got that straight, of the Persian people. So the Persians are not Semites. They're not from the same lineage at all. They're quite different. In fact, one of the things that makes them different is their red hair. You see, many of the Persians actually have red hair, which is highly unusual. We know one other character who was Jewish who had red hair, and actually we know two. One was David, but the other was Esau. Esau had red hair. Esau was also reported to be found in Edom, the red mud, which later became known with the Romans, which later became known with the Europeans. So here we are celebrating again. Now, the word milah shows up only twice, or actually the word milil shows up twice in the Bible. Once here in chapter 21, verse 7. And if you have an art scroll, you can go over to the right, page 44, and go to the top line and go 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth word over, mem, lamed, melil. Speaking of this feast that's going on. The other place you're going to find it is in the book of Isaiah. And so turn back to Isaiah chapter 21. Okay. I want you on that page. It's 987 if you have an art scroll. I want you to look down at verse 11 in chapter 21. Now, in the art scroll, it reads, a prophecy concerning Duma. Now, Duma drives you crazy, except for the fact that in verse number 11, if you look at the notes on the opposite page, the name Duma is a reference to Edom, according to Rashi in his prophecies. God says that Israel cries out to God, its watchman, because of the oppression of the night and exile inflicted by Edom, whose homeland is Seir. So that's an overall view. Let's go back and read the two verses. And then I want to read it as Rashi translated it. He calls out to me because of Seir. Watchman, what of the night? Watchman, what of the night? The watchman said, morning is coming in, but also night. And if you really desire it, repent and come. Now, Rashi looked at that same verse and he saw, oh, by the way, if you want the word Melel, it happens to be the third word on the second line from the bottom. And here a yud has been added to it. So it's the same word fully spelled. But as we go back, this is how Rashi will interpret this verse. The prophet or the angel calls from the yoke of the kingdom of Seir. Watchman, what will be of the night? Watchman, what will be of this darkness? Said the watchman, the only one blessed be he, morning has come. I have the ability to make morning shine for you, and also night is prepared for the wicked. At that time of the end, at the time of the end. Now, if you will request, and if you will make your request to hasten the end of the exile, return and come in repentance. So Rashi reads into this an understanding that maybe he even picked up from the stories in Genesis and from other writings or other speakers. We don't have any idea. But God had prepared the night for his enemies. He prepared that night for Haman's sons, who eventually hung on the gallows. And if you remember in the book of Esther, when you go back to it, you'll find that in Esther, I think it's the third chapter, isn't it? No, 8th time as I look. Yeah, in the 9th chapter. In the 9th chapter, you will get the names of verse 6. You get the names in Shushan, the capital of the Jews, slew and annihilated 500 men. And then listed are the sons of Haman. Well, you have to understand that those names that are listed there are not Persian. They're not Aramaic. But when they began to go back and look at it, they found something unusual about it. If you go to the right side of that same page, page 1766 in the art scroll, you will find that there are 3 of those names that have smaller letters. And then you have one that's enlarged. Now, the 3 smaller letters, the Tav, the Shin, and the Zayin, well, mathematically, because every letter of the alphabet has a mathematic value, Tav being 400, Shin being 300, and Zayin being 7 equals 707. Well, in the year 5707, 10 Germans were hung on the gallows. Now, add to that, the word Aryan became very important to Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler began to associate his nation with being the Aryan race. The interesting thing about that word Aryan comes from its origins. It was Darius the Great, Esther's son, who created the term Aryan. Now you can understand that because if you listen closely, you hear the word Iran. Aryan, Iran, they're both from the same root. So these 10 Aryans are hung on the gallows in 5,707, which happened to be October 16th, 1946. So again, we have another link tying Purim back to Haman, or back to Haman, and Haman back to Og, and we continue to understand that there's more to the story and more that ties the Midrash of Esther together with the Bible. Now, the Bel HaTurim said their extension only comes from a hint in Genesis, and that was the hint of the weaning party. The problem we have in studying the Bible is the fact that the Bible is very brief. It gives us enough information, but then we have to find sources to help us understand that information. For the Jew, he finds his sources through the oral. He finds his sources through the Midrash. He finds his sources through the Zohar. He finds his sources in other places, the Talmud. Over and over, the sources are found. And that is what helps him to connect parts of the Bible that were never there. Now, Rabbi Schneerson, not too many years ago, basically 30, saw this weaning as a hinting of a bar mitzvah, and he ties it back to Og. He says, what was Og saying? Rational. That's why they observe mitzvahs. That's why they study the Torah. That's where their commitment comes from. Og said it at Montana, came from on high, it's free, but see what you can do to make it last. It's just a small portion of 2 verses. And I thank Mendel Kaplan for getting me started, for Schneerson, for all of the other rabbis who participated in this understanding. But folks, the story of the Iranian mullahs declaring war leaves us in a situation where we find something rather strange. You see, the Jew has a chance because obviously the mullahs are not rational people. You know, where is this going? The United States tried to reestablish the 10-year covenant between all the nations, and Iran has already told them, forget that. In fact, many are already saying that they have created enough nuclear fuel that they can fuel multiple warheads, to which the Jews have already said, we can't allow that to happen, because they know that if he has it, he is crazy enough to use it. Mutual self-destruction does not work with a crazy man. And so Israel has only 2 choices. Well, they can bomb and hope that they do well enough that they stop it. Or, as the verses suggest, they can repent. I'm hoping for option 2, because if option 2 is what happens, we will also see the coming of the Mashiach. From my little cloistered room, I bid you farewell. Shalom.